Dear friends from all over Europe, a warm welcome from the European Movement International offices here in Brussels. We are coming to you with another edition of Talking Europe, a series of discussions we have been holding in partnership with the European Commission in an effort to highlight the very important job that the Commission itself, but also the EU in general, is doing. Together with our partners, the Commission, we've had this now for 2-3 years. We have interviewed a variety of people, and today we are very fortunate to have the Deputy Director General of the EU's Anti-Fraud Office. Andreas Schwarz has been in his position for a while now, so he's coming with us with a lot of interesting information about the work of Olaf, as we call it here in Brussels, and of course all the other elements around the spending that the EU does. Andreas, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. And perhaps as a beginning, I should ask the basic question. What is the job of the EU Anti-Fraud Office, or Olaf? What are you there to do?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. In very short words, the job of Olaf is to protect the taxpayers' money of the EU and also protect the reputation of the EU. Let me maybe explain what that means in practice. So we are, on the one hand, looking into irregularities and fraud against the EU budget, trying to investigate such fraud and find people who are involved in this. Here I should say we are independent in our investigation, so nobody can tell us what we should investigate or stop our investigations. So that's an important feature of the work of Olaf. The second point, we are looking into serious misconduct of staff of the EU institutions, which is also very important, again, to protect the reputation of the EU, because if staff of the institutions, even members of parliament or holders of high office, commit fraud against or serious wrongdoing that is not in line with our internal rules, that can damage the reputation of the EU, and we need to look into that. And a third area, which is a bit, if you want, a new area, we are also working in the field of enforcement of certain EU policies. Let me give you some example. For example, there have been cases of food fraud, honey that was not really made appropriately, and that could perhaps have health damages or damages to consumers. We have uncovered a very big scheme of fraud there. We're looking into things like illicit waste shipments. If, for example, waste is illegally exported into third countries against rules, destroying the environment. We are looking also, for example, in illegal imports of so-called F-gases. These are very climate-damaging gases that contribute to global warming. And this is strongly regulated, but there's a lot of crime going around this. So we help DG Klima to stop that kind of illegal trade. And then, other areas where we are protecting certain policies of the EU, and this is an increasingly important area of our work. But that's maybe an explanation of what we do.
That's very interesting indeed. So your job isn't just to make sure that the taxpayers' money are spent properly, but also to make sure that the EU law in many areas is applied and citizens are protected in that sense.
Yes, let me be clear, our main job is to protect the EU budget, and that is the primary, I would say, goal of Olaf. But it is true that increasingly, what you have to know is there is no other investigative service in the Commission. Olaf is the only one who can really do investigations, and we have trained people, we have former police officers, we have public prosecutors, we have judges, we have people who know how to do investigations. And I think there is an increasing realization that is extremely useful for the Commission to have, because we can adopt the smartest policies and strategies. If we don't have the implementation, the enforcement, we are losing credibility. Perhaps one important case in point here are the sanctions against Russia, where there have been several packages of sanctions against Russia, but then there is the realization that not all of that, or some of it, is not really properly implemented. Also here, Olaf can help because we have a very good network with the customs authorities in all member states. We can make sure that no banned products enter the EU, and we have had a case, of wood, trying to be illegally imported via Belarus from, into the EU. We are also working on the export side to make sure that no components for weapon production can be exported via third countries to Russia. So Olaf indeed has increasingly a role of enforcer, and we feel there is a lot of demand for that kind of support because, again, our colleagues in the policy DGs, they are more focusing on making the rules, but not necessarily making sure that they are applied.
This is fascinating and indeed a very important work at the moment, considering the challenges we are facing. Perhaps I should ask, is there a problem with fraud when it comes to spending the EU budget? How busy are you? And is there something that concerns you in your position, but also the EU as a whole?
Yes. Yes and no. I think one has to put perhaps figures a little bit in perspective. So each year we recommend around 500 million, to be recovered from the EU budget out of a budget of 150 billion around. So that's something like 0.3% of the EU budget. When we talk about serious wrongdoing, so if our investigation against staff, we have roughly 30 cases per year that we investigate out of a staff of 30,000. That's something like 0.1%. So we need to put things in perspective. This is not an organization riddled with irregularities and fraud or the EU budget. It's a small share. Still, every case is too much. And we have to pursue every case that is there, or that people also know. If they are trying to engage on that, there's Olaf. And Olaf is likely to find out. So it's a protection. What Olaf really does is to protect the EU budget, but also very strongly the reputation. And if you talk, I think, with many citizens, this is also what they expect, that these kind of things cannot happen. And I think we have had a number of very spectacular success stories that have shown how effective Olaf can be, both in protecting the EU budget and also against, bad, conduct of its staff.
And in some ways, perhaps it's a testament of your success that the name of Olaf isn't widely known, because clearly you have been very good in deterring this kind of fraud. The statistics you just mentioned, the figures are very small indeed, compared perhaps what we see at the national level or in other big countries outside of Europe as well.
Yes, indeed. I think it's always important to put numbers in perspective, because I know, even from discussion with my family, and as the press often focuses on the scandals, there is sometimes the impression, well, the EU budget is riddled with fraud, or so many people are involved in corruption or fraud, and that's simply not the case. I think what one has to be very clear, that's simply not the case. But then again, every case is too much, and we cannot accept any fraud against the EU budget. We cannot accept any wrongdoing of staff, and we are very vigorously pursuing this. And that, again, helps to keep, if you want, the EU budget and the EU institutions clean. And that is what we are trying to do.
And that's very important, especially at a time where citizens turn to the EU for answers to some of the challenges they're facing, especially ahead of the European elections, when citizens will be invited to elect their representatives. It's important that they have confidence in the way that we are managing, you are managing, and you are protecting the European budget. You mentioned there has been a couple of high-profile cases recently. Would you care to share an example or two?
Yes, with pleasure. We've just finished a very big case that involved the illegal importation of undervalued textiles and shoes from China. This was a fraud scheme by certain Chinese fraudsters that basically sold T-shirts and trousers and whatever, imported them to 1/10 or 1/100 of the real price into the EU. And by that, they wanted to avoid customs duties and also subsequently VAT. And Olaf was instrumental in uncovering this scheme and inform member states about this and ask them to take appropriate measures. And I think most member states have done. Unfortunately, the United Kingdom, that now is not a member anymore, for a long time hasn't done appropriate actions. And at the end, we have, of course, passed on the case to DG Budget, who is in charge of collecting these customs duties. And as a result of this investigation, the United Kingdom had to pay 3 billion to the EU budget, including late payment interests, which is, I think, the biggest ever case that we have had. And you can say that was very important, and without Olaf, this case wouldn't have happened. So I think that has been a very spectacular case that was concluded at the beginning of this year. Then there are other cases. We are, of course, also investigating wrongdoing of staff, including in the European Parliament. There has been a case of parliamentary assistants that had illegal external employment, although they were employed by the Parliament. They had activities outside the European Parliament. There has been a conflict of interest. So we have investigated this and brought these people to responsibility. We have uncovered this. And by that, we also have saved €250,000 for the EU budget in payments that shouldn't have been made. So you see, these are the both cases. One would protect the EU budget, this undervaluation case, which led to significant reduction of member states' contribution to the budget because the United Kingdom had to pay this amount. And then the wrongdoing of staff, where we are making sure that staff sticks to the rules, and if not, they will be punished.
So in your work, what would you say are the main challenges that you're facing, both internal but also external, vis-a-vis third countries and other partners in delivering your mandate and protecting the EU budget?
Yes, of course, we face a lot of challenges. I mean, one aspect is we have this whole EU anti-fraud architecture, because we're not the only player. We have the Court of Auditors, we have Europol, Eurojust. We have now the European Public Prosecutor, EPPO, which is a new player. And I think what is very important is that we collectively make this EU anti-fraud architecture work. EPPO exists only for a bit more than 2 years, so we have already, I think, very much improved our cooperation. But I think we still need to find a very, let's say, coherent system where everybody has their clear role. And I think that's a process that's still ongoing. Then a big challenge for Olaf, and I will be very open about this, the Commission in general is under stable staffing rules, but we are getting constantly new tasks. Almost every European Council, and I'm sure you're very much aware of this, think of Ukraine, think of the migration crisis, think of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, to all the Next Generation EU work. Sanctions, and so on and so forth, but we have to do with stable staffing. And that means that effectively in some areas we even have to cut staff, and Olaf had to cut around 50 of its staff, also to help build up the European Public Prosecutor. At the same time, our mandate stays the same, and actually the requirements on us even increase, like for everybody else. And I think one has to be honest about this. This is a major challenge, and we have to find ways to fulfill our mandate in a sense with less staff. And perhaps the third challenge I would mention is we of course experience totally new patterns of fraud. if you look at e-commerce, for example, I mean, e-commerce has exploded in the last 10, 20 years. There are many now new fraud schemes involving e-commerce, for example. Fraudsters have divided certain shipments into smaller packages so they would not need to pay customs duties. And we have to uncover this, but this is very cumbersome because, you know, you can imagine the millions of packages arriving for e-commerce. We have new challenges if you look, for example, at Ukraine, which, as you know, is now a candidate country. The EU has committed to helping Ukraine, of course, now during this period of war against Russia, but also already with a view to their reconstruction and so on. Now, the history of Ukraine in terms of anti-fraud and corruption is a difficult one. I think there has been a lot of progress and we see a strong political willingness to get things on track. But here we are also there to help, you know, as Olaf, to try to help Ukraine, you know, in the field of building up the appropriate capacities. So these are additional challenges that come our way where I think the European citizen expects Olaf to play a role. And we try to do that as good as we can with the limited resources that we have.
Perhaps ahead of the European elections, you know, we will be holding several discussions with candidates all over Europe. Maybe one of the questions we're going to put to them is to what degree they're prepared to invest more resources in Olaf, because like you just mentioned, I think your work is crucial and important to safeguard citizens' trust to it. So yes, we're going to make a mental note and make sure that this comes up with the candidates we'll be speaking with.
Much appreciated.
Well, you know, it's the least we can do, and it's part of our remit anyway to always try to strengthen the European Union, strengthen the European institutions, because we generally believe that the work we do benefits citizens in their everyday life, and so it's something we will do with pleasure. But since we're talking about the European elections, and we will have, of course, a new European Parliament coming ahead, and we're going to have a new European Commission, are there any legislative and policy initiatives that you would like to see coming to the fore in the next 12 months once the new Parliament and the new Commission are in place?
Yes, I think it is actually a very good moment to take stock. I mean, this Commission has, I think, adopted around 500 legislative acts. And in a lot of areas, this has absolutely been necessary. Think of the Green Deal, think of the migration file, all the economic program with the RRF. So, I mean, we have responded to real needs. At the same time, if you adopt 500 legislative acts, the question, and we talked about this earlier, of implementation and enforcement is getting more important. I'm in no position to give advice to the next Commission, but if they were to ask me, my advice is focus more on implementation and enforcement, because this, and you mentioned it, this is determining the trust that people have in the European institutions. Are we not only good in setting new rules, but are we also good in enforcing them? And that's a credibility issue. We see it with the sanctions, we see it with migration policy, we see it with the Green Deal, we see it in all policy areas. If we are not enforcing the rules that we have collectively set ourselves, credibility will suffer and the trust of the people in the European project will suffer. So my advice would be focus more on implementation and enforcement. And here, and I will make no secret out of this, of course, we in Olaf also think of what role we could play. You mentioned our investigative capacity, our potential to ensure in certain areas. I'm not saying that we can ensure enforcement in all areas. There are also other instruments like infringements and so on. But in certain areas, we have a particular expertise. And it may be a good idea for the new Commission to look at this potential of Olaf. And we are certainly ready to contribute to that if we are being asked. And I will not present now the bill with all the additional staff that we would need for this. But of course, if you want to have effective enforcement, then a discussion on staff will be necessary. And perhaps let me use the opportunity. I used to be in charge of the EU budget. I have contributed to the last multi-annual financial framework and Next Generation EU. I know very well the discussion in Council, in particular, when it comes to the staffing of European institutions and the issue of the famous heading 7, so the administrative costs of the institutions. But I think member states will also have to ask themselves, what kind of union do they want? And if they want us to play a role in an increasing number of areas, at a certain moment, the staff will have to follow. And I think at the occasion of the next multi-annual financial framework, for which the Commission will present its proposal in 2025, we have to get honest with each other and say, we cannot continue to keep all the tasks as they are, add more and more, and say you have the same number of staff. You see that the institutions are at the limit of what's possible. By the way, not just Olaf. I know many colleagues in other DGs that are suffering. So I think that, in my humble opinion, will also be a big job for the next Commission to convince Council to add staff to the European institutions.
Believe me, as an NGO in civil society, we know all about being understaffed and overworked. And unfortunately, when it comes to the EU institutions, we tend to focus too much on the cost of things, and we lose sight of the value of things. And perhaps the opportunity cost here is an important argument to make. What would we lose out if we didn't invest more in resources, in staffing, in expertise necessary? Because then the cost will be carried by the taxpayer.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one has to know that the administrative costs are only 7% of the total EU budget, so a relatively small share. And if you look at what this 7% costs bring, that's the whole internal market. That's our trade policy. That's our competition policy. That's economic development all across Europe and all across the world. I think it is an acceptable price for European taxpayers to pay. You can even break this down into whatever 1 cup of coffee per citizen per day. So you know those examples. I think these are not exaggerated costs for a European taxpayer. And indeed, I think the added value that a appropriately staffed civil service, European civil service, has for Europe clearly outweighs the cost.
And I do believe that I think that's something that often is overlooked. Perhaps the effectiveness with which the EU budget is spent and the amount of areas that it covers and how little is actually invested in the resources necessary to perform those tasks. And I do remember not so long ago the discussion around Britain's membership of the EU was always focused on the cost of that. Fortunately, now, years after the decision was made to leave, people are realizing the actual cost of not having the European Union, and I think that's something that has resonated across our continent. You mentioned something quite interesting, the implementation side, making sure that we deliver on the things that we have adopted. There's also the question of culture. How does Olaf work to ensure that within the EU institution there is that culture of transparency, of respect for rules, and of course of avoiding breaking the law?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of our most important aspects of our work is fraud prevention and awareness. Because if fraud has already happened, to uncover it, clean it up, takes an enormous amount of time and resources. And I think every euro spent in fraud prevention. So we have a Commission anti-fraud strategy that involves all DGs of the European Commission, which indeed works in area of fraud prevention. I've mentioned the example of Ukraine, where we are trying to help Ukraine put in place the right structures. But there are other areas which I think are interesting. For example, if we find that a beneficiary has committed fraud, we can basically put this beneficiary on a blacklist. This is, of course, a formal process. There is a certain panel, it's called EDIS panel, that is looking into that. But if verified, that beneficiary cannot apply anymore for EU funding. And that is a measure to prevent future potential fraud. Also in our recommendations, we often see structural problems in certain spending areas where we see, look, this kind of scheme is prone to irregularities or fraud. So we give recommendations how certain programs could perhaps be improved, or how maybe certain member states should pay attention to certain problems. We are also working with all member states and also candidate countries to have a close exchange about our work, to inform each other about fraud trends and so on. And of course, in terms of culture, it is clear that there is zero tolerance against misconduct and fraud. So I think we have this very strongly in the Commission, and I mentioned the figures before that only a small fraction of people are at all even investigated, and let's keep in mind, even if they're investigated, does not necessarily mean they will be convicted of something. But we have a strong anti-fraud culture, but it's something we need to continue to work on, make people aware, have internal trainings, have internal seminars, because that is the best way to prevent and stop fraud, by making people aware also of the traps. There are sometimes difficult choices people have to make, where maybe they're even not in a bad will, but they may do wrong decisions. And so I think our job to try to inform people about these potential risks, like conflict of interest situations, to avoid them from the start so they are not having downstream problems. One element in that context, and I'm sure you're aware of that, is this creation of the ethics body, which is now proposed by the Commission, but involves not just the Commission, but all EU institutions, to set ourselves clear ethic rules and procedures. And we think this is an excellent idea, because all institutions should stick to these rules. Now, what though I would also say is that the European taxpayer, of course, expects that we are very reasonable and sensible with our resources, that we don't have a, as you say in French, double emploi. There we think that even if an ethics body is created, Olaf should be the main institution in charge of all the internal investigations. So not to replicate structures that are already there, that are effective. And for that, and if I may say that, we can investigate wrongdoing of staff, but we have a bit of a problem sometimes to investigate members of parliament, where we are denied access to the premises, to access computers. Of course, we would only do that in case of very founded suspicions. We, of course, totally recognize the independence of MEPs, and we would, of course, not in any way violate the rights of immunity of MEPs. Still, if an MEP is under concrete suspicion of fraud, it is important that this is being investigated. Unfortunately, here we do not have yet access, although in theory we should have access, to offices of members of parliament. We are in dialogue with the parliament, with President Metsola, but we have not yet resolved that question. So that, I think, is something important. And you mentioned the European elections and the Qatar-gate. So if the parliament wanted to do something very visible, they should give Olaf access to the premises and computers of MEPs that are under concrete suspicion of having committed fraud. So that would also be a good contribution to convince the European public of the EU.
This is also something that we would be happy to take on. And again, as a convinced organization that is convinced about the merits of European integration, we have always advocated for transparency, not least because in the vast majority of cases, as you mentioned, there's nothing to hide. And we do agree, of course, that that should apply to all EU institutions, including the European Parliament. And we saw what happened recently. I'm glad you brought up Qatargate. Corruption is everywhere, and we should be able to equip ourselves with the necessary tools to address in those exceptional cases where the rules are broken to the extent that were. So we do echo that sentiment. You've had a long career in the Commission. You've served in many places. You mentioned that before your current role, you also worked for the Director General who is dealing with the EU budget. The EU was confronted with an unprecedented challenge because of the pandemic and the economic and social effects that had, not just the health consequences of the pandemic. And we invested considerably. A huge package of resources was put in on the table to be used by member states. And of course, that spending, that investment, can have other consequences too. How do you see member states also in their performance of ensuring that the EU budget is appropriately spent? It's not just the EU and the institutions, it's also the responsibility of member states. And often those infringements do happen at the national level rather than anywhere else.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Of course, you see, and if you look at the Olaf report, you see a bit where cases are in which member states. I think all member states and our most counterparts in member states are trying their best to spend correctly EU money. Still, sometimes mistakes happen. By the way, they happen in all member states, and they happen at different levels of government. So where there's money, there is always the risk of irregularity and, unfortunately, fraud. What I think is important that there is a very close cooperation between Olaf and the member states, that we have the opportunity to exchange information. And I think in general, this is working fine, but in some cases, we can still improve on this information exchange and in the cooperation. But I think member states are aware of this. Now, what is, of course, a new feature, and I don't know if you hinted a little bit at that program, is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is a huge program with, I think, some 500 billion euros that has to be spent in a relatively short period of time, namely until 2026. So within 4 or 5 years, which is a lot. And of course, without revealing too much, because as you know, I may not refer to individual investigations, but of course we see some problems in that area. We have fortunately had a lot of training session before the start of the RRF. We have had we have included a lot of rules and anti-fraud provisions into that program. Still, we see in the actual implementation that there can be problems. And we are, of course, looking into that also very closely, because, again, it always comes back to the same question. We have to make sure that money is spent according to the rules, appropriately. If we find this has not been the case, the European taxpayer expects us to put our foot down, and sometimes it may be just irregularities. That means there is no intentional fraud, but sometimes there can also be fraud, and we have to be vigilant about this. But just to reassure everyone, Olaf is looking very closely into the implementation of the program. We are also in contact with member states. We want to make sure that this money is really spent for recovery, building up structures. And I think there also have been successes. I think if you look at the development of Spain, for example, I think there has been very significant progress, and it has helped to stabilize certain countries that were particularly affected by the pandemic. So we see all the positive things. Still, our role as Olaf is, of course, also to make sure that the money is spent according to the rules, and that's what we do.
That's great. And perhaps as a last question, the European movement was created 75 years ago, even before the birth of the EU. In many ways, the European Union was put in place to turn a dream into reality. And if you fast forward 75 years since then, we have seen huge achievements in the process of European integration. From your vantage point, having served the EU from various positions, what would you like to see in the next years, decades perhaps? What developments in the journey of European integration to make our union stronger and better equipped to serve citizens?
Let me first of all congratulate you on your work and the 75 years. I have had a lot of dealings with the European movement also in Germany, the country I know best. And I must say I'm a big fan of your organization, and really congratulations for your excellent work, which is hugely important. Now, my personal opinion is that we have to strike the good balance in many policies, because we see that we are for the moment confronted also by a strong increase in, let's say, anti-European or Europe-skeptical movements. I know this from Germany, but we see this in other member states. A lot of that is unfortunately linked to the issue of migration, as you know. And I hope and I understand that the legislative program on the latest migration package is making progress. We will have to find a good way between protecting the EU, at the same time remain open, and strike the right balance to take wind out of the sails of some of the European Eurosceptical parts of the population. I think the same will hold true for enlargement. I think the biggest challenge, in my opinion, for the next Commission will be enlargement, because Ukraine has, I would say, some legitimate expectations, but countries in the Balkans as well. So how do we strike the right balance between, integrating these countries, but at the same time making sure that we are not blocking ourselves? I find that a hugely important question, and there's no easy answer, and it is not my policy remit now, but I think this enlargement question, in my opinion, will be a crucial one for the future of European integration. And I hope our politicians will take wise and smart decisions, again, that allow to integrate these countries, but at the same time making sure that we remain capable to act, and that we are not importing blockage, in our decision making. That's maybe my answer to your question.
That's excellent, and we will be here pushing forward and always advocating for a stronger, more democratic European Union, and we very much count on your support in that end. And of course, your presence here is a testament to your commitment, both to the values that the European movement and the European Union serves, but also to advancing the project going forward. Thank you very much, Andreas. This has been a fascinating discussion, remarkably interesting and very informative. And for you watching this, carry on the conversation, leave your comments, your ideas about the work Olaf and Andreas do, but generally about the EU, either on social media or on our website, europeanmovement.eu. We will continue with these discussions in the weeks and months ahead, especially ahead of the European elections. So stay tuned and keep watching. In the meantime, have a good day and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.